So what if you could understand desire like a spy decodes a secret message? Today, we're going to break down a framework for female sexuality that was actually developed by a former CIA officer. Yeah, you heard that right. It's a pretty unique way of looking at attraction, not as some kind of magic, but as a code. So let's jump right in.
The source material kicks off with this really bold idea that for a lot of people, especially men trying to understand women, desire feels like a total mystery, right? An unsolvable puzzle. It suggests that there's a big disconnect in how we usually think about arousal. So, what's the proposed solution? How do we crack this supposed code? Let's find out.
Okay, here's our game plan. We're going to start with the core theory. Then we'll walk through 5 really distinct archetypes of attraction. And finally, we'll see how it all clicks together with a concept the source calls concordance.
All right, so what's the big idea at the heart of all this? Well, according to this framework, to really get it, you have to start with a tale of 2 very, very different models for male and female arousal.
Okay, so this is where you really see the core difference. On one hand, you've got male arousal, which is shown here as being pretty straightforward, a single physiological process. Think of it like a straight line from point A to point B. But then you look at the model for women, and it's described as a shell game. You've got 3 interconnected parts, the psychological, the physiological, and the cognitive. And they can shift around, change in importance, not just from woman to woman, but even for the same woman at different times in her life.
So, with that 3-part model in our heads, let's see how it actually plays out in these 5 archetypes of desire. We're going to start with 2 that are all about different kinds of power and status.
First up, we've got the powerful billionaire. And of course, the source points to Christian Grey from 50 Shades of Grey. But here's the crucial distinction. The fantasy isn't really about the money, the cars, or the helicopters. It's about what all that represents: absolute power, competence, and a kind of unshakable confidence.
So what makes this archetype tick? Well, it works on a few different levels. Cognitively, you might think, this man has everything, so he can't possibly need anything, which is fascinating. He's dominant, decisive, but here's the real psychological hook according to the source. It's that hidden vulnerability. The idea that this incredibly powerful man has a secret weak spot that only she can get to, and maybe even heal.
All right, next up is the high authority figure. Now, this isn't about money. It's about pure mastery in a specific field. We're talking about the top surgeon in the world, a 4-star general, or a genius gourmet chef. The power here comes from being the absolute best at what they do.
So the core fantasy here isn't to become a master yourself, but to win the respect and admiration of this person at the top of their game. You know, the source points to classic tropes, like the boss and the secretary. The psychological thrill is that this connection totally jumps over a logical hierarchy. It's an attraction so powerful, it kind of breaks the rules.
Let's switch gears a bit and dig into our next section, which covers 2 archetypes that tap into something a little more, well, fundamental. We're talking about the appeal of raw, untamed energy on one hand, and the deep, deep need for safety on the other.
And this image, well, it perfectly sums up our 3rd archetype, the tamed beast. Think about characters like Edward Cullen from Twilight or the Beast from Beauty and the Beast. These are figures with immense, almost primal power.
So what's really going on here? It's all about the dynamic of control. This character is this unstoppable force to literally everyone else in the world, but he willingly submits to the influence of just one woman. The source explains that the psychological fantasy is being the lion tamer, you know? The one person who can calm this wild power and be completely safe with it.
The 4th archetype is the protector. This one taps right into that psychological desire for security, for comfort, for reliability. You know, think of a bodyguard, a soldier, a secret agent, someone whose whole mission is to keep her safe.
According to the source, this archetype is especially powerful when a woman feels vulnerable, because it taps into that really fundamental feeling of being cared for. And it's not just about physical safety, it's about protecting her reputation, her future, the whole shebang. The key insight here is that this deep foundation of security is what allows an emotional and eventually a sexual connection to really grow.
All right, let's move on to our final archetype. The source actually calls this one the rarest and often the most obvious when you see it in action. This is the exception to the rule.
So why is it so rare? Well, the framework suggests it's because mystery, by its very nature, implies a bit of danger and uncertainty, right? And that totally goes against that powerful drive for security we just talked about with the protector. So naturally, it appeals to a much smaller group.
And that archetype is the mysterious man. This is your classic bad boy, or maybe a literary figure like Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice. Kind of aloof, emotionally distant, and just really hard to figure out.
So with this one, the initial spark isn't necessarily physical or even emotional. It's cognitive. It's like a puzzle that you just have to solve. For women who are really challenge-oriented, the fantasy is about cracking his code, getting under his skin, and being the one person who can finally fix him. The source also notes this tends to be more appealing to younger women than to more mature, successful women who, might value stability over a project.
Okay, so we have these 5 archetypes: the billionaire, the genius, the beast, the protector, and the mystery man. But how do they actually work in the real world? This brings us to the final and maybe the most important concept in this whole framework, something the source calls concordance. Concordance is defined as the specific order of operations that triggers arousal in a particular person. Honestly, the best way to think about it is like a unique recipe. It's the special sequence of events that takes someone from feeling totally neutral to being aroused, and that recipe is different for everybody.
And this is where the paths really split. The source suggests the male process is typically direct, almost universal. A visual cue leads to physiological arousal. Simple, A to B. For women, though, the process is described as totally unique and non-linear. The first step might be a feeling, like a sense of warmth, or something cognitive, like reading a romantic story, which then kicks off this much more complex sequence that eventually leads to arousal.
So this is it. This is the big takeaway that ties everything together. The 5 archetypes, they are not the formula themselves. They are the key that unlocks the door. The idea is to figure out which archetype appeals to a specific woman and then embody it. Doing that is what triggers her unique cognitive and psychological hooks, and that is what starts her personal concordant process, her unique recipe for arousal.
Ultimately, this whole framework challenges us to see desire not as some math problem to be solved, but as a language to be learned. What's really fascinating is how these archetypes, the billionaire, the authority, the beast, the protector, and the mystery man, are basically the main characters in all our most popular stories. It really suggests that our stories about attraction, our fantasies, they almost always revolve around power, safety, and the thrill of taming the unknown. It's a fascinating and maybe a much more personal way to think about human connection.